The Los Angeles sun had barely crested the Hollywood Hills when Maxwell Sterling's car pulled up to the gleaming glass tower that housed the studios of America's most-watched morning talk show, The Daily Voice. The building stood as a monument to modern media, all reflective surfaces and sharp angles, a structure that seemed designed to broadcast its own importance to the world below. Maxwell sat in the back seat of the luxury sedan, his eyes closed, breathing slowly. At 56 years old, he'd become something of an anomaly in the entertainment industry, a leading man who'd not only survived 3 decades in Hollywood but had done so while maintaining an almost monk-like privacy. His face was known to hundreds of millions worldwide, yet the man behind that face remained largely a mystery, and that was exactly how he preferred it. "Mr. Sterling, we've arrived," his driver Thomas said gently. Thomas had been with Maxwell for 15 years and knew his employer's routines, his preferences, his need for those few extra moments of quiet before stepping into the chaos of public life. "Thank you, Thomas," Maxwell replied, opening his eyes and offering a genuine smile, the kind that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. It was this quality, this authentic warmth, that had made him one of the most beloved figures in cinema. As Maxwell stepped out of the vehicle, a small group of fans who'd been waiting outside the studio erupted in excited cheers. There were perhaps 24 of them, clutching photographs, movie posters, and homemade signs declaring their admiration. Maxwell didn't hurry past them. He never did. "Good morning, everyone," he said, his voice carrying that distinctive timbre that had narrated a generation's favorite films. He approached the barricade, shaking hands, signing autographs, making eye contact with each person as if they were the only one there. A young woman, probably in her early 20s, thrust forward a worn paperback book. "Mr. Sterling, this is the novel that your movie The Last Guardian was based on. I've read it 17 times because of your performance. Would you sign it?" Maxwell took the book gently, examining it with genuine interest. The cover was indeed worn, the pages clearly read and reread. 17 times? He asked with a warm smile. "Then this signature isn't for me to give, it's earned. What's your name?" "Sarah. Sarah Chin." Maxwell wrote a thoughtful inscription, taking his time despite the publicist hovering nearby and anxiously checking her watch. When he returned the book, Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you for reading," Maxwell told her quietly. Readers keep stories alive long after cameras stop rolling. This was who Maxwell Sterling was. A man for whom fame had never become a barrier between himself and other human beings. He'd grown up in modest circumstances, the son of a mechanic and a librarian, in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's struggles and triumphs. Success hadn't changed that fundamental connection to humanity. If anything, it had deepened his appreciation for genuine human interaction. Inside the studio, the atmosphere thrummed with controlled energy. Production assistants moved with purposeful haste, their clipboards and tablets glowing with schedules and notes. Camera operators made minute adjustments to their equipment, testing angles and lighting. Makeup artists prepared their stations, laying out brushes and palettes with the precision of surgeons arranging their instruments. Maxwell was escorted to the green room, a space that was actually decorated in soothing earth tones rather than green, a Hollywood irony he'd always found amusing. A production assistant, a young man named David who couldn't have been more than 23, offered him coffee, tea, water, or basically anything else you might want, Mr. Sterling. "Coffee would be wonderful, David." "Black, please. And please call me Maxwell." David blinked, clearly surprised. "Oh, sure, Maxwell. I'll be right back." As David hurried away, Maxwell settled into one of the comfortable chairs and pulled out his phone. He had messages from his agent, his publicist, and his co-star from his latest film, Horizon's End. The film had opened 3 weeks earlier to phenomenal box office success and critical acclaim. It was the reason for this morning's appearance, a standard promotional obligation that his team had arranged months ago. The premise had been straightforward. He'd discuss the film, share some behind-the-scenes stories, perhaps talk about his upcoming projects and his charitable foundation. Nothing controversial, nothing complicated. Just another stop on the endless promotional circuit that was part of modern filmmaking. But Maxwell Sterling didn't know, couldn't have known, that the host of The Daily Voice, Victoria Harmon, had other plans for their conversation. In her private dressing room 3 floors above, Victoria Harmon sat before her mirror, studying her reflection with the critical eye of someone who'd spent 25 years in front of cameras. At 61, she remained a formidable presence, sharp-featured, impeccably styled, with eyes that could shift from warm to withering in an instant. Victoria had built The Daily Voice from a simple morning talk show into a cultural institution. For 2 decades, It had been the place where celebrities came to be charming, where authors promoted their books, where chefs demonstrated recipes, and where the day's lighter news was discussed with just enough substance to feel informative without being challenging. But 5 years ago, everything had changed. The shift had been gradual at first. A pointed question here, a challenging follow-up there. Victoria had discovered that controversy drove ratings in ways that pleasantness never could. An uncomfortable interview generated clips that went viral, think pieces that drove traffic, social media debates that kept the show trending for days. More importantly, Victoria had found her true calling, holding the powerful accountable, or at least that's how she'd come to frame it. In reality, her accountability journalism had evolved into something else entirely, a form of performative moral superiority where guests were invited on the show and then interrogated about their political beliefs, their charitable giving, their social media posts, and any perceived failures to meet Victoria's exacting standards of public virtue. Her co-hosts had learned to follow her lead or face irrelevance on their own show. Cassandra Mills, the former federal prosecutor, provided legal analysis and reinforced Victoria's positions with the authority of her background. She was sharp, articulate, and had long ago decided that aligning with Victoria was the path to maintaining her prominent seat at the table. Jennifer Park, a comedian who'd transitioned into political commentary, offered occasional counterpoints but mostly supported the show's increasingly confrontational approach. She'd built her brand on truth-telling, which in practice meant agreeing loudly with Victoria's perspectives. Rebecca Torres, the youngest host at 38, had joined the show 2 years earlier with hopes of bringing lighter, more human interest content. She'd quickly learned that such contributions were tolerated but not valued. The real action, the real impact, came from the confrontations. And finally, there was Margaret Whitmore, the show's moderator and senior voice. At 65, Margaret had spent 4 decades in journalism, earning respect through thoughtful reporting and measured analysis. She'd watched with growing concern as the Daily Voice had transformed from a platform for conversation into an arena for combat, but her attempts to moderate the show's direction had been increasingly sidelined. This morning, Victoria had reviewed her research on Maxwell Sterling with particular intensity. Her team had compiled everything: his interviews over 30 years, his social media presence, minimal, his political donations, none on public record, his public statements on social issues, remarkably few, and most frustratingly, his consistent refusal to align himself publicly with any political movement or cause. To Victoria, this silence was damning. In an era where every celebrity was expected to use their platform for advocacy, Maxwell Sterling's quietness felt like an affront. He was one of the most famous actors in the world, with influence that could move millions, yet he refused to wield that influence in the ways Victoria deemed appropriate. She'd invited him on the show with a specific purpose: to expose this silence, to force him to either declare his positions or be revealed as someone who cared more about his career than about justice. It would make for compelling television, generate massive social media engagement, and reinforce the Daily Voice's position as the place where no one, not even beloved movie stars, was above scrutiny. Victoria's assistant, Lauren, knocked softly before entering. "Mr. Sterling is in the green room. Hair and makeup are standing by. We're on schedule for the top of the hour." "Good," Victoria replied, applying her lipstick with practiced precision. "Make sure he's comfortable. Offer him whatever he wants." Lauren hesitated at the door. "Victoria, I've been reviewing the segment notes. Are you sure you want to go this hard on Maxwell Sterling? The audience loves him and his charity work is actually quite extensive." "That's exactly the point," Victoria interrupted, turning from her mirror. "He does charity work quietly, privately, without using his platform to advocate for systemic change. That's not enough anymore, Lauren. Silence is complicity. If we don't challenge him, who will?" Lauren nodded, though her expression suggested doubt. She'd worked for Victoria for 7 years and had seen this pattern before: the careful research, the planned confrontation, the absolute certainty that what they were doing was righteous rather than simply ratings-driven. She'd also seen the aftermath: the viral clips, the divided social media reactions, the occasional guest who fought back effectively, and the more common result of someone being unprepared and overwhelmed. But Maxwell Sterling wasn't just anyone. He was perhaps the most universally beloved figure in entertainment, someone who'd earned respect not through publicity campaigns but through 3 decades of consistent kindness, professionalism, and genuine humility. Challenging him seemed less like accountability journalism and more like searching for controversy where none existed. Still, Lauren kept these thoughts to herself. Victoria Harmon didn't respond well to dissent, and Lauren valued her position too much to risk it. The studio audience filed in with palpable excitement, their chatter filling the space with warm energy. Many had come specifically because Maxwell Sterling was scheduled to appear. They clutched their phones, ready to capture moments they could share. Some wore t-shirts featuring his most famous characters. Others had brought items they hoped to get signed during commercial breaks. The warm-up comedian did his routine, getting the audience energized, teaching them when to applaud, when to laugh, how to react to the applause signs. But he didn't need to work very hard this morning. The crowd was already electric with anticipation. In the control room, director Marcus Webb reviewed the camera positions one final time. He'd been directing The Daily Voice for 12 years and had learned to anticipate Victoria's moods, her tactics, her strategies. This morning's rundown had raised his concerns. "Are we really doing this?" he'd asked Victoria during their pre-show meeting. "Doing what?" she'd replied innocently. "You know what? The ambush setup. Maxwell Sterling isn't some politician or controversial figure. He's coming here to talk about his movie." Victoria's expression had hardened. "Every guest is here to be challenged, Marcus. That's what we do now. That's what our audience expects." "Some of our audience," Marcus had corrected. "We've lost viewers, Victoria. Significant numbers. People are tired of every interview becoming an interrogation. Then they can watch fluff somewhere else," Victoria had snapped. "We're doing important work here." Now, watching the audience's genuine excitement on the monitors, Marcus felt a familiar sense of dread. This wouldn't end well. He could feel it. The countdown began. 10 seconds to air. The theme music swelled, bright and energetic. The cameras came alive. The lights intensified. And the Daily Voice began another broadcast, one that would become far more memorable than anyone except Victoria Harmon anticipated. "Good morning, everyone." Victoria's voice carried practiced enthusiasm as she smiled into the camera. "We have an extraordinary show for you today. Our special guest is an actor whose career has spanned 3 decades, whose films have entertained billions, and whose presence both on screen and off has made him one of the most respected figures in entertainment. Please welcome Maxwell Sterling." The audience erupted, not with polite applause, but with genuine, enthusiastic, standing ovation reception. Maxwell emerged from backstage and the noise level somehow increased. People were standing, clapping, some wiping tears from their eyes at simply being in the same room with someone whose work had meant so much to them. Maxwell's response to this adoration was characteristically humble. He didn't pose or preen. He simply smiled warmly, waved, placed his hand over his heart in a gesture of genuine appreciation, and made his way to the guest chair. He greeted each host personally, shaking Margaret's hand warmly. They'd met years before at a charity function. Embracing Jennifer, who'd interviewed him once early in her career and remembered his kindness. Offering Cassandra a respectful nod. Giving Rebecca an encouraging smile that suggested he recognized a kindred spirit trying to navigate difficult waters. And then there was Victoria. She remained seated, which itself was unusual. Most hosts stood for guests of Maxwell's stature. Her smile was professional but cool, appraising rather than welcoming. "Victoria," Maxwell said pleasantly, extending his hand. She took it briefly. "Maxwell, thank you for joining us." "My pleasure," he replied, settling into the guest chair with natural grace. Everything about his demeanor suggested openness, friendliness, and complete lack of defensiveness. He was a man who'd come for a pleasant conversation and expected nothing else. The first segment proceeded exactly as Maxwell had anticipated. Margaret led the discussion about Horizon's End, asking about the physically demanding role, the emotional challenges of the character, the experience of working with the acclaimed director. Maxwell was an excellent interview subject. Articulate, thoughtful, generous with anecdotes that were genuinely interesting rather than rehearsed. He spoke about training for 6 months to perform his own stunts, about the injury that had nearly derailed production, about the young actress making her debut in the film and how talented she was. "The action sequences are spectacular," Jennifer commented, "but what really struck me was the emotional depth. Your character is dealing with profound loss, with questions about whether justice and revenge are the same thing. That resonated powerfully." Maxwell nodded. "That's why I was drawn to the project. Yes, there's spectacular action, and that's entertaining and exciting, but underneath it all, it's asking genuine questions about how we respond to trauma, whether violence ever truly solves anything, how we find meaning after losing everything we thought defined us. Those are universal human questions." The audience applauded warmly. This was the Maxwell Sterling they'd come to see. Intelligent, emotionally articulate, deeply engaged with his craft beyond just the surface spectacle. Rebecca jumped in, asking about his charitable foundation, the Sterling Initiative, which had been building schools and funding education programs in underserved communities for 15 years. Maxwell's response was typical of his approach, deflecting credit, praising the educators and administrators doing the actual work, expressing gratitude for being in a position to contribute financially while others contributed their time, expertise, and passion. But Maxwell, Rebecca pressed gently, your foundation has funded over 200 schools, provided scholarships for more than 10,000 students, built libraries, computer labs, art programs. That's not just financial contribution, that's transformational impact. He shrugged with genuine modesty. I've been extraordinarily fortunate in my career. Using those resources to create opportunities for young people isn't charity, it's responsibility. It's investment in futures that matter far more than any movie I'll ever make. More applause, even more enthusiastic. The energy in the studio was beautiful, warm, positive, celebratory. Everyone in that room, including the camera operators and production assistants, felt the goodness of this moment. Everyone except Victoria Harmon. She'd been quiet throughout this opening segment, uncharacteristically so. While her co-hosts engaged warmly with their guest, Victoria sat with her fingers steepled, her expression thoughtful, her eyes never leaving Maxwell Sterling. She was waiting, calculating, preparing for her moment. That moment came just before the first commercial break. Maxwell, Victoria's voice cut through the warm atmosphere like a blade, I want to shift our conversation in a different direction if I may. The sudden change in tone was jarring. Margaret glanced at Victoria with visible concern. Rebecca's smile faltered. Even the audience seemed to sense something shifting, their easy enthusiasm cooling slightly. Maxwell turned his attention to Victoria with open, friendly interest. Of course. You've built this remarkable career, this beloved image. The humble star, the generous philanthropist, the man who stays above the fray, Victoria began, her tone suggesting these qualities were somehow suspect rather than admirable. But in an era where our democracy is under threat, where marginalized communities are fighting for their very existence, where every voice matters in the struggle for justice, you've been remarkably silent. The studio went quiet. This wasn't a question, it was an accusation. Maxwell's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, a recognition perhaps that this interview had just transformed into something else entirely. I'm not sure I'd characterize my work as silent, he said carefully. I've been quite vocal through my foundation about the importance of education, about creating opportunities. But not politically, Victoria interrupted. You don't endorse candidates. You don't speak out about legislation. You don't use your enormous platform to advocate for the systemic changes that would actually address the root causes of the inequalities your charity treats as symptoms. The attack was clear now. This wasn't a conversation, it was a trial, and Maxwell was the defendant. I believe in living my values rather than broadcasting them, Maxwell replied, his voice still calm but with a new undercurrent of steel. I vote, I support causes I believe in, I try to make a positive impact through my actions. But I don't think my political opinions are more valuable than anyone else's simply because I'm recognizable. That's a luxury position, Cassandra interjected, supporting Victoria as expected. When you have the platform you have, the influence you have, choosing not to use it for political advocacy is itself a political choice. It's a choice that supports the status quo. Maxwell turned to face Cassandra directly. Is it? Or is it a recognition that people are capable of making their own political decisions without celebrity endorsements? That maybe treating audiences as intelligent individuals rather than followers who need guidance is actually more respectful? A significant portion of the audience applauded, loudly. Victoria's jaw tightened. This wasn't going as she'd planned. Maxwell Sterling wasn't apologizing or becoming defensive. He was pushing back articulately and effectively. We're going to take a quick break, Margaret announced, clearly trying to defuse the situation. When we come back, more with Maxwell Sterling. The moment the cameras cut, the studio erupted in confused chatter. The audience didn't understand what had just happened. They'd come expecting a celebration and instead witnessed the beginning of an interrogation. Maxwell remained seated, his posture relaxed but his mind clearly working. He caught Margaret's eye and she gave him an apologetic look that confirmed his suspicion. She hadn't known this was coming either. Victoria stood and walked off set without a word, leaving her co-hosts to exchange uncomfortable glances. When they returned from commercial, the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. The audience's enthusiasm had been replaced by tension. Maxwell's easy openness had been supplemented with visible wariness. And Victoria Harmon had decided to abandon any pretense of journalistic courtesy. "Maxwell, let's be direct," she began the moment they were live again. "You've built your career on playing heroes, men who stand up for what's right, who fight injustice, who don't remain silent in the face of wrong. Yet in your actual life, when real injustice needs real heroes, you choose silence. Doesn't that strike you as hypocritical?" The question hung in the air like poison. It was designed not to elicit information but to wound, to force Maxwell into a defensive position where any answer would sound like an excuse. But Maxwell Sterling had not survived 3 decades in Hollywood by being easy to manipulate. "Let me ask you something, Victoria," he said quietly, leaning forward slightly. "When you go home tonight, after this show ends, after the cameras stop rolling, after your makeup comes off, what do you do? How do you contribute to making the world better?" Victoria's eyes flashed with anger at having her question turned back on her. "I use this platform to hold powerful people accountable, to ask difficult questions, to shine light on." "You perform," Maxwell interrupted gently. "You perform accountability for an audience that already agrees with you. You create spectacles of interrogation that generate viral clips and social media engagement. And that's fine, it's entertainment, it's your job. But don't confuse it with actual sacrifice or actual risk or actual work." The audience gasped. Some burst into applause. Others looked shocked. Victoria's face had flushed red. "How dare you," she hissed. "I've spent my career fighting for your ratings," Maxwell continued, his voice still quiet but carrying clearly through the silent studio. "You've transformed this show from a platform for genuine conversation into a courtroom where you play judge, jury, and executioner. And anyone who doesn't perform their values in exactly the way you demand gets convicted of moral failure." Jennifer tried to jump in to support Victoria. "That's not fair, Maxwell. We're trying to use our platform to divide people," Maxwell said, turning to face her. "To create an atmosphere where having complex views makes you suspect. Where not reducing everything to simple political binaries makes you complicit. Where the only acceptable way to be good is to loudly announce your goodness according to very specific ideological requirements." He stood up now, not to leave yet, but because sitting felt wrong for what he needed to say. The cameras zoomed in instinctively, capturing every nuance of this moment. "I grew up poor," Maxwell said, his voice taking on a new intensity. "My father worked 3 jobs. My mother cleaned houses for wealthy families who never learned her name. I wore second-hand clothes, ate meals at school because we couldn't afford breakfast at home, and shared a bedroom with 2 brothers in an apartment where the heat didn't always work in winter." The studio had gone absolutely silent. Even Victoria seemed frozen. "I built this career from nothing," Maxwell continued. "From auditions where casting directors told me I'd never succeed. From years of rejection and doubt and sleeping in my car between gigs. And yes, I've been phenomenally successful, beyond anything I imagined possible. But I have never forgotten where I came from. I have never lost sight of the real struggles real people face. And I refuse, absolutely refuse, to let you or anyone else suggest that my value as a human being is measured by how loudly I perform my politics for your approval." The audience erupted. Standing ovation. Thunderous applause. People weren't just clapping, they were cheering, many with tears streaming down their faces. Maxwell wasn't just defending himself, he was defending them, all the regular people who felt constantly judged, constantly found wanting by cultural elites who seemed to care more about ideological purity than actual human dignity. Victoria Harmon, for perhaps the first time in her television career, found herself completely at a loss for words. Margaret attempted to restore some order. "I think we all need to take a breath here and—" "No," Victoria interrupted, having found her voice again, though it trembled slightly with anger. "I don't need to take a breath. I need to understand how someone with Maxwell's platform can justify remaining silent while—" "While what?" Maxwell cut her off, his patience clearly exhausted. "While you've decided that only your form of activism matters. While you've appointed yourself the arbiter of who's doing enough and who isn't. While you've transformed moral concern into a performance art where the loudest voices get the most credit regardless of what they actually accomplish." He moved closer to where the host sat, his presence commanding the entire studio's attention. "I spend my time with teachers," he said, his voice passionate now. "Real teachers in real schools with real students facing real challenges. I sit with them. I listen to their struggles. I learn what they actually need. And then my foundation works to provide those resources, not with press conferences or social media campaigns, but with quiet, sustained, unglamorous work that doesn't generate headlines. I visit hospitals," he continued. I sit with sick children and their terrified parents. I hold their hands. I listen to their stories. I laugh with them and sometimes cry with them. And I donate millions to support research and treatment, not because it enhances my image but because it's the right thing to do. His voice grew stronger. I fund scholarships for students who have no other path to higher education. I build libraries in communities that have been systematically denied resources. I support organizations fighting poverty, homelessness, domestic violence. And I do all of this without demanding credit or recognition or political allegiance from anyone involved. The audience was on their feet again, applauding so loudly that Maxwell had to pause. But according to you, he said, looking directly at Victoria, none of that matters because I won't perform my activism in the specific way you demand. Because I won't reduce complex social issues to simplistic political talking points. Because I won't treat my audience like children who need a celebrity to tell them what to think. Cassandra tried one more time to support Victoria's position. But Maxwell, surely you can see that remaining silent on critical issues. I'm not silent, Maxwell said firmly. I'm selective. I'm intentional. I'm respectful of the intelligence and autonomy of the millions of people who watch my films. They don't need me to tell them how to vote or what to think. They need me to tell stories that move them, challenge them, entertain them, and maybe help them think about the world in new ways. That's what art does. That's what authentic contribution looks like. He turned to address the cameras directly, speaking past the hosts to the audience at home. To everyone watching this, I want you to know something, he said, his voice gentle now but no less powerful. You don't need celebrities to validate your beliefs or guide your politics. You don't need us to tell you how to be good people. You're living real lives, facing real challenges, making real sacrifices every single day. You're the ones doing the actual work, raising families, supporting communities, showing up for each other. That's where real heroism lives. Not on television, not in Twitter threads, but in the quiet, daily acts of ordinary people doing extraordinary things without any expectation of recognition. The emotion in the studio was overwhelming. People weren't just applauding anymore, they were crying, embracing each other, feeling seen and validated in ways they rarely experience from celebrity culture. Victoria Harmon, watching her carefully planned ambush collapse into complete disaster, made one final desperate attempt to regain control. So you're saying accountability doesn't matter? She asked, her voice sharp with desperation. That powerful people shouldn't be questioned about their choices? Maxwell turned to her one last time, and his expression was almost pitiful, not mocking, but genuinely sad for what she'd become. Accountability matters tremendously, he said quietly. But what you're doing isn't accountability. It's performance. It's spectacle designed to make you feel righteous while accomplishing nothing of actual substance. Real accountability happens in voting booths, in communities organizing for change, in sustained pressure on actual power structures. It doesn't happen in ambush interviews designed to generate viral moments. He reached down and unclipped his microphone, the gesture deliberate and symbolic. I came here this morning in good faith, he said, his voice carrying through the silent studio. I came prepared to have an honest conversation about my work, my life, the things I care about. Instead, I walked into a trial where the verdict had been decided before I ever sat down. Where the only acceptable outcome was my confession that I haven't lived up to your standards, my apology for not performing activism in the way you demand, my pledge to do better according to your definition of what better means. He placed the microphone carefully on the arm of his chair. I won't do that, he said simply. I won't apologize for living my values authentically. I won't feel shame for respecting my audience's intelligence. I won't perform for your approval or anyone else's. And I won't participate in a form of journalism that's really just disguised bullying. Margaret Whitmore stood, her face showing a mixture of respect and regret. Maxwell, I apologize. This wasn't what I expected either. If I'd known. I know, Maxwell said gently, offering her a sad smile. You're one of the good ones, Margaret. I've always respected your work. But this show. He gestured to the set around them. This isn't journalism anymore. This is theater. And I'm not interested in playing the role you've cast me in. He looked one more time at the audience, at the hundreds of faces watching him with overwhelming support, and gave them a small, grateful nod. Then, with the same quiet dignity that had defined his entire career, Maxwell Sterling walked off the set of The Daily Voice. Behind him, chaos erupted. Victoria Harmon sat frozen, her face pale. Cassandra and Jennifer exchanged panicked glances. Rebecca Torres looked like she wanted to applaud. Margaret Whitmore simply shook her head sadly, recognizing she'd just witnessed the moment that would likely define and possibly end the show she'd spent years building. The director, uncertain what else to do, cut to commercial. But it was far too late. The damage, or depending on perspective, the truth, was out. Within 60 seconds of Maxwell Sterling walking off the set, the first clips hit social media. The segment had been streaming live, and viewers across the country had been screen recording the most powerful moments. Twitter erupted first. #StandWithMaxwell began trending before Maxwell had even left the building. Within 5 minutes, it had accumulated over 100,000 tweets. Within 30 minutes, that number had grown to over 2 million. Within 2 hours, it was approaching 10 million mentions and was trending not just in the United States but globally. The clips told the story more powerfully than any article could. Maxwell's calm defense of his choices, his passionate speech about authentic contribution, his devastating critique of performance activism, his gentle but firm refusal to be bullied into conforming to someone else's definition of virtue. Contrasted against all of that was Victoria Harmon's aggressive questioning, her visible anger when challenged, her complete inability to recognize that she transformed from interviewer to interrogator. Celebrities began weighing in immediately. Directors, co-stars, crew members, anyone who'd ever worked with Maxwell shared stories of his professionalism, his kindness, his quiet generosity. Director Catherine Rodriguez posted, "I've made 4 films with Maxwell Sterling. Never once have I seen him treat anyone, from leads to background extras, with anything less than complete respect. Watching him be attacked for not performing his values publicly is everything wrong with our current culture. The man lives his principles. That should be enough." Actress Sofia Martinez shared, "When my father was dying of cancer, Maxwell learned about it and called me personally. Not through publicists, not through agents. He called, asked what he could do, and then donated $250,000 to the hospice facility where my father spent his last weeks. He asked me never to make it public. That's who Maxwell Sterling is." Author David Chin wrote, "Maxwell's foundation paid for my entire college education. I grew up in poverty, had no path to higher education, and his scholarship changed my life. I never met him. There was no publicity. Just support that transformed my future." And Victoria Harmon has the audacity to suggest he's not doing enough. The stories multiplied exponentially. Thousands, then hundreds of thousands of people sharing their experiences with Maxwell or with his foundation's work. Teachers whose schools had been transformed by his support. Students whose lives had been changed by his scholarships. Hospital staff who'd witnessed his visits to sick children. Community organizers whose programs he'd funded without seeking credit. But the most powerful responses came from ordinary people who'd never met Maxwell Sterling but felt he'd spoken for them in that studio. A teacher named Rachel Williams posted, "I spend 12 hours a day trying to educate children in an underfunded school with resources I mostly buy myself. I don't need millionaire TV hosts lecturing me about doing enough." Maxwell Sterling was right. Real work happens quietly without applause, every single day. Thank you for saying what millions of us needed to hear. A nurse wrote, "I work 3 jobs to support my family. I volunteer at my church. I try to be a good neighbor and raise decent kids. But according to people like Victoria Harmon, none of that matters because I'm not loudly political?" Maxwell spoke for all of us today. A mechanic shared, "I'm a conservative. Maxwell Sterling has never told me my beliefs are wrong. He makes films I can enjoy with my progressive daughter, and we both love them for different reasons." That's the point he was making, respecting that people have complex views and don't need celebrities to guide them. I'll support him forever for that. The response wasn't just supportive, it was overwhelming, unprecedented, passionate. People weren't just defending Maxwell Sterling, they were celebrating someone who'd finally articulated what they'd been feeling for years. Exhaustion with performative virtue, frustration with being constantly judged by those who seemed more interested in appearing righteous than being good, and appreciation for someone who lived authentically rather than performing for approval. News outlets scrambled to cover the story. Within hours, think pieces appeared analyzing the confrontation from every angle. Media critics discussed what the incident revealed about modern celebrity journalism. Political commentators weighed in from their respective perspectives. Everyone had an opinion, and most of those opinions aligned decisively in Maxwell's favor. Even publications typically aligned with the Daily Voice's political perspective struggled to defend Victoria Harmon's approach. "There's a difference between accountability journalism and ambush television," wrote prominent media critic Jennifer Santos. Victoria Harmon crossed that line so definitively that even those who share her political beliefs found themselves defending Maxwell Sterling. When you invite someone onto your show under false pretenses and then attack them for not performing activism in your preferred way, you've abandoned journalism entirely. The backlash against Victoria and the Daily Voice was intense and immediate. Advertisers began pulling their spots within hours, not wanting their brands associated with what was being described as bullying disguised as journalism. The financial implications were severe and mounting by the hour. Behind the scenes at the Daily Voice, emergency meetings convened. Network executives, show producers, legal teams, crisis PR specialists, everyone huddled to discuss damage control. But there was no controlling this damage. The video evidence was too clear, the public response too overwhelming, the verdict too decisive. Victoria Harmon, for perhaps the first time in her career, was being held accountable by the very public she'd claimed to represent. And she discovered something uncomfortable: being questioned felt very different when you were on the receiving end. That evening, Victoria Harmon sat alone in her dressing room, scrolling through social media on her phone despite knowing it would only make her feel worse. Every scroll brought new condemnation, new defense of Maxwell, new mockery of her approach. A knock on her door interrupted her spiral. Margaret Whitmore entered without waiting for permission. "We need to talk," Margaret said quietly, closing the door behind her. "If you're here to tell me I was right." "I'm not," Margaret interrupted. "I'm here to tell you that you've destroyed this show and possibly your career." Victoria's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with defensive anger. "I was holding him accountable. I was asking the questions that you were performing," Margaret said, her voice weary. "Exactly like Maxwell said. You weren't interested in conversation or understanding. You wanted a spectacle. You wanted to be seen as the courageous truth-teller bringing down even beloved figures who didn't meet your standards. And it backfired completely. The audience stood and applauded for him," Margaret said. "Our own audience in our own studio chose him over us. Doesn't that tell you something?" Victoria's jaw tightened. "It tells me they don't understand what's at stake. It tells me that people would rather be comfortable than confronted with their complicity." Margaret stared at her colleague with something approaching pity. "Do you hear yourself? You're so convinced of your own righteousness that you can't even consider the possibility that you might be wrong. That maybe, just maybe, there are many valid ways to contribute to making the world better. That maybe public political performance isn't the only form of valuable activism. So we should just let celebrities hide behind their charity work and never pressure them to." "Maxwell Sterling has donated over $200 million to charitable causes," Margaret interrupted, her voice sharp now. "He's built schools, funded scholarships, supported hospitals, empowered communities. He's done this quietly, sustainably, and without seeking credit. And you had the audacity to ambush him on national television and suggest it wasn't enough because he won't perform politics in the way you demand." She moved closer to Victoria, her expression a mixture of disappointment and frustration. "I've been in journalism for 40 years, Margaret said. I've interviewed presidents, investigated corruption, covered wars, and tried to bring truth to light. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that what you did today wasn't journalism. It was ego. It was the worst kind of self-righteous performance, where being seen as courageous mattered more than whether you were actually right." Victoria's eyes filled with angry tears. "I thought you were on my side." "I'm on the side of truth," Margaret replied. "And the truth is that Maxwell Sterling showed more integrity in 30 minutes than we've demonstrated in years. He was right about what this show has become. And unless we're willing to acknowledge that and change, we're finished." She walked to the door, pausing before leaving. "The network is convening a meeting tomorrow morning," Margaret said. "They're going to ask for your resignation. I wanted you to hear it from me first." After Margaret left, Victoria sat in silence, her phone continuing to light up with notifications she no longer wanted to read. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to consider an uncomfortable question. What if Maxwell Sterling was right? In the days following the confrontation, the entertainment industry underwent a quiet but significant reckoning. The incident had exposed something many had felt but few had articulated: the exhaustion with performative activism, the hunger for authenticity over announcement, the desire for respect rather than lecture. The Daily Voice announced significant format changes. Victoria Harmon took a temporary leave to pursue other projects. Industry code for being fired without the public humiliation of an official dismissal. Cassandra Mills also departed, accepting a position at a cable news network where her confrontational style would be more appropriate. Jennifer Park remained but in a reduced capacity. Margaret Whitmore, Rebecca Torres, and 2 new co-hosts rebranded the show with a focus on genuine conversation rather than confrontation. The ratings initially dropped. Controversy had been driving viewership, but gradually stabilized with a different, more loyal audience that appreciated the return to respectful dialogue. Maxwell Sterling, true to character, made no public statements about the incident. He didn't gloat or condemn. He didn't use the massive support he'd received to launch attacks on his critics. He simply returned to his life, completing promotional obligations for Horizon's End, working on his next film, continuing his foundation's work without fanfare. 6 weeks after the confrontation, a journalist from a respected magazine finally secured an interview with Maxwell. It was the only time he agreed to discuss what had happened. "Do you regret how you handled that morning?" the journalist asked. Maxwell considered the question carefully. "I regret that it escalated to that point. I regret that Victoria felt attacked, even though I believe my criticisms were valid. But do I regret defending my approach to living my values? No. I think that conversation needed to happen. You've been praised by people across the political spectrum for what you said. Does that vindicate your position?" "It's not about vindication," Maxwell replied. "It's about respect. Respect for audiences, for complexity, for the reality that there are many ways to contribute to a better world. I'll never claim my way is the only way or even the best way. But it's authentic to who I am and I won't apologize for that." "What do you think Victoria Harmon got wrong?" Maxwell was quiet for a long moment. "I think she forgot that the people watching her show are complex human beings living complicated lives. She started seeing them as an audience to perform for rather than as individuals to communicate with. And once you make that shift, you start measuring success by how righteous you appear rather than whether you're actually connecting with people or making a difference." "Do you think celebrity activism is valuable?" "Of course," Maxwell said immediately. "When it's genuine, when it comes from real understanding and commitment, when it's sustained beyond the immediate publicity moment, absolutely. But when it becomes primarily about being seen as activists rather than about the actual work, when it's more performance than principle, then it becomes counterproductive." The interview was widely read and discussed, primarily because Maxwell articulated positions many held but had been unable to express clearly. He wasn't against activism or political engagement. He was against the reduction of complex issues to simple performance metrics, against the assumption that only one form of contribution mattered, against the weaponization of moral judgment to enforce ideological conformity. 8 months after Maxwell Sterling walked off the set of The Daily Voice, he stood on stage at the Humanitarian Awards Gala, accepting recognition for his foundation's work. The audience included educators, community organizers, activists, and philanthropists, people doing actual work rather than just talking about work. In his acceptance speech, Maxwell returned to the themes that had defined that explosive morning. "I'm grateful for this recognition," he said, holding the Crystal Award. "But I accept it on behalf of the thousands of teachers, administrators, counselors, and community members who do the real work. I provide funding. That's the easy part. They provide time, expertise, passion, and love. They show up every day for students who need them. That's where transformation actually happens." He paused, scanning the audience. "In our current culture, we've become obsessed with performance," he continued. "With being seen doing good rather than simply doing good. With announcing our values rather than living them. With judging others by their public statements rather than their actual contributions. And I think that impulse, while perhaps well-intentioned, ultimately distracts from the actual work of making the world better. The teachers in this room don't need to perform their commitment to education. They live it every day," Maxwell said, his voice carrying genuine emotion. "The social workers don't need to announce their dedication to helping others. They demonstrate it through sustained, unglamorous work. The community organizers don't need to virtue signal their values. They organize, mobilize, and create change." He held up the award. "This is beautiful and I'm honored. But the real measure of impact isn't awards or recognition or social media praise. It's the student who becomes the first in their family to graduate college. It's the community that gains resources it never had before. It's the child who discovers a love of reading in a library that didn't exist until we built it. That's what matters. That's where real change lives." The audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 10 minutes. Outside the gala, Victoria Harmon sat in her car, watching the live stream of Maxwell's speech on her phone. She'd been invited to the event. Her name was still significant in certain circles, but had declined, knowing her presence would become a story that overshadowed the actual purpose of the evening. As she listened to Maxwell speak, something inside her finally cracked open. Not anger or defensiveness, but something closer to understanding. He was right. She had become so focused on being seen as righteous, on performing moral superiority, on using her platform to judge others, that she'd lost sight of what actually mattered. Genuine connection, authentic contribution, real work that changed real lives. She typed a message on her phone, her fingers hesitating over the send button for several long moments before finally pressing it. Maxwell, this is Victoria Harmon. I know this message may not be welcome, and I understand if you don't respond. But I wanted to say something I should have said 8 months ago. I was wrong. Not just in my approach that morning, but in my entire philosophy about what meaningful contribution looks like. You tried to tell me, but I was too invested in my own righteousness to hear it. I'm sorry. Truly sorry. I hope your continued work brings all the change you're striving for. You deserve it. Maxwell read the message later that evening, after the gala had ended and he'd returned to his hotel room. He stared at the words for a long time, considering his response. Finally he typed, Victoria, thank you for this message. It takes real courage to reconsider positions we've held strongly. I hope you find a path forward that feels authentic to you and contributes positively to the world. We both want the same thing, a better, more just society. There are many roads to that destination. Wishing you well, Miss. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was grace. And in that moment, both of them, the actor who'd refused to perform and the host who'd forgotten the difference between performance and principle, took small steps toward something more important than being right, being genuine. Horizons and won Best Picture at the Academy Awards. When Maxwell took the stage to accept the award as the film's lead actor and executive producer, his speech lasted less than 2 minutes. This film exists because hundreds of talented people devoted years of their lives to bringing a story to life, he said simply. It succeeded because audiences chose to spend their time and money experiencing that story. I share this with everyone who contributed and everyone who watched. Thank you for making art that matters possible. No political statements. No grand speeches about the state of the industry or the world. Just genuine gratitude and immediate deflection of credit to others. Backstage, a young entertainment reporter asked him about the incident with the Daily Voice, which by then had become part of Hollywood legend. The moment a beloved actor had finally said what millions were thinking. Do you think that confrontation changed anything? The reporter asked. Maxwell smiled slightly. I hope it reminded people that authenticity matters. That living your values is more important than performing them. That respect for audiences, for complexity, for different approaches to making the world better, that respect is crucial. Would you ever go back on the Daily Voice? The reporter pressed. If they invited me for a genuine conversation? Perhaps, Maxwell replied. But I'd only go if both of us could show up authentically, without performance, without agenda, just two people trying to understand each other's perspectives. That's how real dialogue works. He started to walk away, then turned back. You know what I've learned from all of this? He asked. That most people, regardless of their politics or beliefs, are trying their best. They're living complex lives, making difficult decisions, doing what they can with what they have. And they don't need celebrities or media personalities or anyone else telling them they're not doing enough or thinking correctly. They need respect. They need recognition of their efforts. They need less judgment and more grace. That's what I try to offer in my work and in my life, Maxwell continued. And I think if more of us, in entertainment, in media, in every field, focused on genuine contribution rather than performing contribution, on respecting people rather than judging them, on building up rather than tearing down, the world would be significantly better. He smiled warmly at the young reporter. But that's just one man's opinion. What do you think? The reporter, caught off guard by being asked rather than told, stammered for a moment before offering her own thoughts. They spoke for several minutes, a genuine exchange of ideas without performance or pretense. Other reporters waiting nearby watched with something approaching envy. This was what real conversation looked like, what authentic connection felt like, what the entire industry had been missing. Later that night, video clips of Maxwell's backstage conversation went viral, not because they were controversial or confrontational, but because they were simply real, genuine. Two people talking honestly about complex issues without reducing everything to simple binaries or performing for invisible audiences. This is what we lost, one commentator wrote. The ability to just talk to each other. To disagree without demonizing. To have complex views without being reduced to simple categories. Thank you, Maxwell Sterling, for reminding us what authentic dialogue looks like. In the years that followed, Maxwell continued working, making films, supporting his foundation, living quietly and authentically. He never became politically outspoken in the way some demanded. He never used his platform to lecture or judge or enforce ideological conformity. But his schools continued educating students. His scholarships continued changing lives. His hospital donations continued supporting research and treatment. His community programs continued empowering neighborhoods. And his films continued bringing people together, creating shared experiences across every demographic divide. He remained as he'd always been, genuinely good without needing to announce that goodness. Authentically kind without performing that kindness. Deeply principled without weaponizing those principles. And in a culture increasingly exhausted by performance and hungry for authenticity, Maxwell Sterling became something rare and precious. Proof that you could live your values without broadcasting them, contribute meaningfully without seeking credit, and maintain integrity without compromising or conforming. The morning he'd walked off the Daily Voice had seemed at the time like a moment of conflict, of breakdown, of failure. But it had actually been something else entirely. A moment of truth, of clarity, of someone finally saying what needed to be said about the difference between performance and principle, between appearing good and being good, between demanding conformity and offering respect. And that truth resonated because it was genuine. Because it came from someone who'd spent decades living his values rather than announcing them. Because it reflected what millions of people already knew but had been unable to articulate clearly. Not everyone needs to be loud to make a difference. Not everyone needs to perform their values to prove they have them. Not everyone needs to conform to someone else's definition of what meaningful contribution looks like. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply live authentically, contribute genuinely, and let your actions speak louder than any announcement ever could. That was Maxwell Sterling's legacy. Not the films, though they were significant. Not the awards, though they were numerous. But the reminder that character doesn't need an audience, that principle doesn't require performance, and that the quietest voices often carry the deepest truth. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything that mattered.